Whoa, whoa, whoa. Hold on. Did you just walk into a billionaire security tryout with a child? Bro thought this was a field trip. Where's her lunchbox, man? They laughed when Dane Mercer walked in carrying a 4-year-old girl and a stuffed bear with one eye missing. 58 candidates stood in the lobby of Kestrel Tower wearing pressed suits and polished shoes. Every one of them had a folder. Every one of them had a story about how dangerous they were. Then the glass door swung open. Wrinkled blue shirt, scuffed boots, a little girl on his hip with her face pressed against his neck like she was still half asleep. The bear dangled from her fist by one chewed ear. The laughter started before he reached the front desk. Someone in the third row said it loud enough to carry. Bro thought this was a field trip. More laughter, the kind that builds because people feel safe inside it. Dane Mercer didn't turn around. He set the girl down, fixed the collar on her jacket with 2 fingers, and walked toward the registration table like the room behind him didn't exist. 18 seconds later, Knox Ibarra, 240 pounds of professional fighting record, was face down on the mat with his arm locked behind him at an angle that made 3 people in the room look away. Nobody laughed after that. Not even Sloane Voss, who had moved close enough to see everything, standing still at the edge of the training floor while something shifted inside her chest that she wasn't prepared to name. The Kestrel Group occupied the top 20 floors of its building in downtown Atlanta. Security software, government contracts, private client protection architecture, the kind of company that didn't advertise what it actually did. 58 candidates. Each one is hand-selected. Each one arriving with the posture of a man who had already decided he was the answer. Then Dane Mercer walked in. Marcus Pride moved across the lobby before the clerk finished reaching for her tablet. 36, wide through the chest, with the particular confidence of someone who had already written the ending of today in his head. As acting head of security, he had reasons to be threatened by this tryout. He stopped directly in front of Dane, close enough to make the size difference obvious. Is this a custody hearing or a job interview? The room gave him what he was looking for. Dane looked at Marcus once. My name's on your list. 9 o'clock. Marcus picked up the tablet. Something crossed his face for half a second. Something he buried quickly. The name Dane Mercer sat at the very top of the candidate roster. Added Sunday evening. Added personally by Sloane Voss, CEO of the Kestrel Group. Little Wren walked to a small waiting area near the reception desk, where a junior staff member had set up coloring sheets and a low table. She sat down, placed the bear on the chair beside her, opened to a blank page, and began drawing without asking anyone anything. Dane walked onto the floor. The first round was not about strength. The men before Dane arrived with printed service records, laminated credentials, photographs of themselves with notable clients. 2 of them opened with the phrase, "In my 15 years of experience." Dane came to the desk with nothing in his hands. Your materials? He placed a single sheet of white paper on the desk. 1 phone number, 1 sentence beneath it. Call this if you need to know who I am. Marcus, standing 4 feet away, exhaled through his nose. You're serious? Very. The second part was a response assessment. Each candidate watched a 90-second video and had 30 seconds to identify threat positions. Knox watched it and identified 4 of the 6 marked positions. The room approved. Dane watched it once. He stood with his arms at his sides. 6 marked positions, 2 unmarked. The camera dead zone behind the pillar on the left gives a 4-foot unobserved approach angle. The man in the gray hoodie has repositioned his hands 3 times since the clip started. He's carrying something he hasn't decided whether to use yet. 2 seconds of silence. Lucky red, Marcus said. Dane returned to his seat without answering. On the 31st floor, Sloane Voss was watching the feed on the monitor above her desk. She sat with a notepad on her knee she hadn't written in for 22 minutes. Her assistant, Simone Lark, stood near the door. He doesn't fit the profile, Simone said carefully. No, Sloane said. He doesn't. 3 weeks earlier, an unmarked envelope had arrived on her desk. Inside was an 11-page document, service record, skills assessment, personal profile on one Dane Mercer, no sender, no return address. At the bottom of the last page, 1 typed sentence. She's going to need him. On the monitor, Dane sat in his chair with the same expression he'd had since walking in. Not bored, not patience, simply present. The way someone is present when they have nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. Sloane set her pen down. Marcus Pride had personally arranged the physical round bracket that morning. He had placed Dane Mercer against Knox Ibarra with the quiet satisfaction of someone removing a problem before it becomes inconvenient. Knox read his name on the bracket and smiled, not a cruel smile. He simply didn't experience this as a contest. Phones came out. The mood had shifted into something between sport and foregone conclusion. Upstairs, Simone leaned toward the monitor. Sloane. They put him against Ibarra. Sloane was already standing. The screen is too small. She arrived at the training floor without announcement. The room reorganized itself instantly. Postures straightened. Conversations stopped mid-breath. She didn't look at Knox Ibarra. She had already assessed Knox. Powerful, credentialed, completely readable. She looked at Dane. He was crouched at the edge of the mat, relacing his left boot, not looking at Knox, not looking at the crowd, not looking at her. In 11 years as CEO, Sloane Voss had sat across from hundreds of people working very hard to make an impression on her. Dane Mercer appeared to have decided it was simply irrelevant to his current task. That single fact held her attention more than anything else she had seen all morning. Knox stepped onto the mat. "You don't have to do this, man. Nobody's going to judge you." Dane finished tying his lace. He stood up, stepped onto the mat, and faced the center of it with the stillness of a man who had already decided what was about to happen and found the decision unremarkable. In the waiting area, Wren had stopped drawing. She was watching through the narrow window. "Is your dad good at this?" Wren held the bear tighter. "He doesn't lose, but he never talks about it." The timer started. Knox came forward immediately. Same sequence he had used all morning. Close the distance. Establish grip. Control weight. It ended 4 matches before 10 o'clock. Dane moved back, not scrambling. One precise step. His weight shifted to the outside edge of his left foot in a way that redirected Knox's approach angle by a fraction. Barely visible. Barely anything. Knox's grip closed on air instead of shoulder. By the 9th second, Sloane had stopped breathing at her normal rhythm. She was watching Dane's eyes. They weren't tracking the way a fighter's eyes tracked. They were still, focused on something deeper than individual movement. Dane gave Knox something on each exchange, a fraction of an opening, a half step of apparent vulnerability. Each time the follow-through found nothing there. Sloane's hand found the doorframe without her noticing. At the 17th second, Dane's eyes changed. A small contraction, almost nothing. He had seen what he needed to see. He had spent 16 seconds not fighting Knox Ibarra. He had spent 16 seconds learning him. At the 18th second, Dane stepped in instead of back. What followed happened too fast for most of the room to process. One arm controlled the elbow at the joint. The other made a small, decisive adjustment to Knox's center of gravity. Not a throw in any traditional sense. A redirection so precise that Knox's own momentum became the mechanism of his fall. Knox Ibarra hit the mat face down and didn't move. Total time, 24 seconds. No one spoke. Dane released his hold, stepped back, stood upright, breathing unchanged. He turned his hands over once, mechanical check, nothing more, and stepped off the mat. Marcus Pride's clipboard made a flat sound against the floor. He didn't seem aware it had fallen. Wren appeared at the doorway and crossed the floor to her father with the focused urgency of a small child on a mission. "Dad, are you done?" Dane crouched down to her level. "All done. Can we get a snack? What do you want?" She thought about this with complete seriousness. Goldfish. The rainbow kind. Done. He stood, took her hand, and walked toward the exit. Sloane Voss stood at the door. Her hand dropped from the frame. She turned and walked. Back to the elevator without a word. Simone fell into step beside her. For the length of the corridor, neither of them said anything. Then Simone said very quietly, "His breathing didn't change." "I know," Sloane said. And somewhere between the lobby and the 31st floor, she acknowledged to herself, as a private and purely operational observation, that she had not looked at a single other person in that room for the last 8 minutes. She called him up before the bracket finished. Sloane's office occupied the northeast corner with floor-to-ceiling windows that returned the city in clean rectangular sections. Her desk held exactly 3 things: a monitor, a notepad, a glass of water. Wren stepped inside, stopped, and looked around. "It's really clean in here, but there's nothing fun to look at." Sloane looked at the girl. A beat passed. "I know." She slid a folder across the desk. "Sit down." He sat. Wren settled beside him and began drawing without being asked. Sloane asked about the technique on the mat. He said it came from specific training in specific environments. He didn't elaborate. She asked about his service record. He said it was in the folder she had already reviewed. She asked who sent her the 11-page document. For 2 seconds, something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, calculation, then a deliberate settling. I don't know. She watched him. He was telling the truth. That was the part that bothered her most. She signed the contract without renegotiating. Downstairs, Marcus Pride received the news on his phone, stared at the screen, and called a number that didn't appear in Kestrel's company directory. The call lasted 38 seconds. The first week, Dane worked like he didn't exist. Exactly 1 step behind Sloane. Not 2, not beside her. 1 step. He knew which conference room doors ran on delayed hinges before he reached them. He read meeting spaces before she entered them. He knew when someone was carrying tension before the conversation surfaced. In 11 years of running Kestrel, Sloane had never had a security detail she forgot was there because it simply functioned that naturally. He wasn't positioned toward her because she was important. He was positioned toward her because she was his responsibility. The distinction was so unfamiliar, it took her 3 days to name it. That evening, an anonymous email arrived on Sloane's personal account. 9 words. You're being sold, and you don't know it yet. Attached was a screenshot of a clause from a merger agreement she had signed 7 months earlier with Praxis Holdings, led by a man named Conrad Hale. The clause had a small marker at the bottom. Section 11. She called her legal team. The explanation she received back felt carefully constructed. Sloane sat at her desk and stared at the wall. Dane was standing near the window. He had been there since she finished. Do you know anything about this? Not enough yet. But I'm looking. Dinner with Conrad Hale was arranged for Thursday, the kind of restaurant where the lighting was designed to make powerful people look comfortable. Hale was 61, polished, with the particular benevolence of a man who had learned that appearing harmless was more effective than appearing strong. The meal moved through its early stages like theater. Then, during the main course, he dropped it casually. The Q4 benchmarks will, of course, be the natural inflection point. Given Section 11, Sloane set her fork down with the careful motion of someone who does not want their hands to express what their face will not. Of course, she said. Hale smiled with the warmth of a man who believed he had already won. I want to be clear, Sloane. I'm not your adversary. I'm simply practical. I appreciate that, Conrad. In the car afterward, the city moved past the windows in white and amber streaks. Dane drove. Neither of them spoke for 20 minutes. Then Sloane said, Did you read the contract before you took this job? First morning. Section 11. Section 15. Appendix D. A pause. She looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Why would you read my contracts? Can't protect you if I don't understand the ground you're standing on. She watched him in the mirror. His jaw had a line of tension in it that hadn't been there during dinner, which meant he had been performing calmly in that restaurant the same way she had. And she hadn't seen it until now. That realization settled into her chest and stayed there. 3 nights later, the security log showed a 9-minute gap. No footage, no error code, just the gap. Technically impossible unless someone had created it from the inside. Dane found it during his end-of-day review. He copied the log and sat for a long time looking at that 9-minute window. He had spent 5 years identifying internal network compromises, situations where the threat wasn't external. It was living inside a trusted structure. He knew what the early architecture of a betrayal looked like. He was looking at it now. Marcus Pride had access to the camera system. Marcus Pride had a number in his contacts that didn't belong to Kestrel, and Marcus Pride had been in the building during those 9 minutes. Dane closed his laptop and began building a different kind of record. The conversation about Lena happened on the 12th night. Wren had a low fever. Dane asked if he could leave at 7 instead of 8. Sloane stood up and got her coat. You don't have to. I know. His apartment was clean, small, almost nothing in it that wasn't functional except for one corner that belonged entirely to Wren. Drawings covered the wall, books stacked in bright columns, a basket of stuffed animals in some arrangement with its own internal logic. Later, after Wren was asleep and the bowls had been rinsed, they sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. Sloane asked about Wren's mother. Dane was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had crossed a line. Then he turned the cup once in his hands and said her name was Lena, that she had been killed in a car accident 4 years ago when Wren was 2, that he had been on a mission when the call came, that he had been on a transport home within 8 hours and out of service within 90 days, that he had not gone back. He said all of it directly, without asking for a particular response. Sloane didn't offer sympathy in the standard arrangement of words. She sat with it and then said, "Is that why you always stay exactly one step back?" He looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, the expression on his face was not the expression of a person doing a job. It was something older, less defended. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. In the morning, she called the investigator no one at Kestrel knew about. She gave him the phone number from Dane's single sheet of white paper. The result came back within hours. The number belonged to a retired brigadier general named Raymond Cross, who had commanded Dane's unit for 3 years. Cross was the one who sent the 11-page document. Cross knew about Hale. Cross had known for longer than she had. Sloane read the name and sat back in her chair. Then she said to herself, "In the empty office, I've been surrounded, and I didn't see it." The emergency shareholder session arrived on a Tuesday. What Dane saw in the 48 hours before the meeting was not consistent with routine anything. Service elevators accessed after hours. Visitors registered under a firm name that didn't exist in Kestrel's database. Monday evening, motion sensors on the 31st floor logged a 7-second anomaly, 7 seconds of detected presence, then nothing. They had been overridden, not fooled. Someone was planning to access Kestrel's central server during the session, when every decision-maker would be in one room, focused on one problem, facing one direction, 800 corporate accounts, in the wrong hands, worth more than the merger itself. He had 35 minutes. He moved through the building the way he had been trained, not running, not conspicuous, with the efficiency of someone who is committed to a route entirely. He cleared the lower floors, secured the boardroom, placed Simone at Sloane's side, and reached the 31st floor via the rear stairwell. They were already there. 4 of them, professional, unhurried, moving toward the server room with the confidence of people who had been told the floor would be clear. It was not clear. The first 2 were immobilized before the third finished processing what was happening. The third came from the left. He had anticipated the angle. The fourth lasted 11 seconds. Then Marcus Pride stepped out of the eastern corridor with a firearm and the flat expression of a man who had arrived at the part he had been rehearsing. "I need 12 minutes. Stand down and nobody gets hurt." Dane's left shoulder had taken a hit. Nothing structural. He filed it and moved on. "I don't have 12 minutes." Marcus was skilled and committed, but he was operating on the logic of threat. Dane was operating on the logic of necessity. Necessity has a particular advantage in close quarters. When security arrived 2 minutes later, Marcus Pride was seated against the wall, hands immobilized, wearing the specific expression of a man who had bet on the wrong outcome and knew it. Downstairs, Sloane sat at the head of the table with 28 shareholders and 1 Conrad Hale in front of her. She had received the update through her earpiece 60 seconds earlier, absorbed it, processed it, returned her face to its baseline. She let Hale finish his sentence. Then she said, "This session will need to be postponed. Law enforcement will explain the reasons within the next few minutes." 1 beat. Section 11 will also be contested under Clause 19B, which provides for nullification in cases of documented partner fraud. "I have the documentation." Hale sat very still. "I've been building the file," she said, "for 9 days." Dane declined the first ambulance. Sloane met him in the lobby, looked at his shoulder and the state of his shirt, and said simply, "I'm driving." He started to say something. She held up her keys. At intake, she gave his name and insurance information from memory. She had reviewed all personnel files the weekend after his hiring, a fact she had not mentioned to him. In the exam room, she took gauze from the supply shelf and began working on the cut on his forearm without asking. He found that notable. "You know how to do this?" "No. But I learn fast." Wren arrived with Simone and covered the distance to her father's bed in 4 steps. She held his hand for a moment without speaking. Then she looked at Sloane with the careful assessment she applied to questions that mattered. "Can you stay? I don't want him to be alone when he's hurt." Sloane looked at Dane. He was studying the wall above the bed with the focused attention of a man who had decided to examine the paint very carefully. She pulled the chair beside the bed closer and sat down. Okay. By 11, the corridor was mostly quiet. Wren was asleep on the waiting room bench, her head resting on Sloane's jacket. The bear fitted into the space between her chin and chest. Sloane sat without moving, one hand resting lightly near the girl's shoulder. Dane stood at the doorway, cleared for discharge but not yet gone. He watched the two of them in the yellow corridor light and didn't speak for a long time. Sloane looked up. Neither of them said anything. Dane walked back in and sat on the other side of Wren. The girl lay between them with the bear occupying the center. After a while, Sloane said quietly, "She added to the drawing." He waited. "The one she gave me last week. She came in this morning before I arrived and added something." "What did she add?" "A door," Sloane said. "She drew a door on the house and a welcome mat in front of it." Dane was quiet. The corridor light made its low, even hum. Wren breathed in the slow rhythm of a child who trusted entirely, without condition, that the world around her was held. For the first time in that long and breaking day, for the first time perhaps in a good deal longer than that, the corner of Dane Mercer's mouth moved, small, quiet, unmistakably a beginning. And somewhere in the top left drawer of Sloane Voss's desk, a crayon drawing of 3 figures stood in front of a house with a door, and a welcome mat, and a tree with green leaves, and a sky that had been colored yellow. Because Wren Mercer, age 4, with one-eyed bear and complete certainty, had already decided how the story ended long before either of the adults had figured out they were in one.